I want you to stop what you're doing right now. Put the phone down. Turn off the noise, because what I'm about to say to you, people don't want to hear this. Priests won't say this from the pulpit, or your friends won't bring it up at dinner. The culture has made it socially unacceptable to even whisper what I'm about to tell you openly. There isn't much time left. I don't mean that as a metaphor. I don't mean it as a motivational phrase to get you moving. I mean it as a theological and spiritual diagnosis of where we are right now as a civilization, as a church. And most importantly, as individual souls, standing before the living God. Every generation thinks they're living in the end times. I know that. And I'm not here to tell you the date or the hour, because no man knows that. But here is what I can tell you as someone who has spent decades studying demonology, spiritual warfare, the mystical tradition of the church, and the science of the soul. The trajectory we are on is not sustainable, and souls, real human souls made in the image of God, are being lost at a rate that should terrify every one of us out of our spiritual complacency. The devil doesn't need your dramatic fall. He just needs your slow drift. He just needs you distracted enough, comfortable enough, numb enough. And right now, he's winning that battle in millions of homes, including perhaps yours. So, before I go any further, I need you to decide if you actually want to hear the truth. Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. When the truth is going to cost you something, let's begin. Let me tell you something that the saints of every century before us would have found absolutely astonishing. We live in the most materially comfortable society in the history of the human race. We have food delivered to our door. We have heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. We have access to the entire accumulated knowledge of human civilization sitting in a glass rectangle in our pocket. Our ancestors worked themselves into early graves just to survive, and they did it with a level of clarity about eternal things that we have almost entirely lost. And yet we are more spiritually confused, more disordered, more anxious, more broken, and more lost than perhaps any generation that has come before us. How is that possible? Because comfort, when it is untethered from God, does not produce peace. It produces softness. It produces an interior life that has no calluses. It produces a soul that has never been trained to endure, to suffer, to sacrifice, and therefore a soul that crumbles at the first real confrontation with reality. The fathers of the church were very clear on this. St. John Climacus, writing in the 6th century, warned that the great enemies of the soul are not the dramatic sins, not murder, not apostasy. The great enemy is sloth, acedia, the spiritual numbness that creeps in when a person is not actively fighting against it. The condition where you are technically doing the right things on the outside, going through the motions, showing up to Mass on Sunday, saying a few prayers, but internally the fire has gone completely out. That is the condition of the Western Church right now. And I say this not as an accusation. I say it as a diagnosis because a doctor who refuses to name the disease out of politeness is not kind. He is negligent. We are living in a fog of spiritual blindness so thick that most people don't even realize they're in it. And the tragedy, the absolute heartbreaking tragedy, is that this fog has penetrated not just the secular world. It has penetrated our families. It has penetrated our Catholic homes. It has penetrated our seminaries, our chanceries, our convents. I've spoken with priests who have lost their faith quietly, men who still celebrate Mass every morning, who hear confessions, who give homilies, and who have privately, in the secret interior of their souls, stopped believing. Not because they encountered some brilliant philosophical argument against Christianity, but because they stopped praying, because the spiritual disciplines fell away, because they were never trained, truly trained, in the interior life. And so when the darkness came, as it always comes, they had nothing left to stand on. This is not an abstraction to me. This is something I have encountered over and over again in the confessional, in spiritual direction, in exorcism cases. You would be shocked, genuinely shocked, at the number of people who come to me not because they've been attacked by some external demonic force, but because they have hollowed themselves out from the inside through years of spiritual neglect. And the enemy simply walked through the door that was already open. Now, someone will always ask me, Father, isn't this kind of alarmist? Haven't there always been spiritual crises in every age of the church? Yes, there have. And the church has always survived them because the church is divine in her origin and divine in her protection. But here is what is different now. What is categorically qualitatively different about our moment in history in every previous age of crisis? The Arian heresy, the Protestant revolt, the French Revolution, the modernist infiltration of the early 20th century. There was always a critical mass of people who knew something was wrong. There were always men and women who were awake, who were sounding the alarm, who were willing to suffer social consequences to speak the truth. The darkness was visible precisely because it contrasted against something that was still lit. What I am watching happen now is different. The lights are going out, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family, soul by soul. And what terrifies me more than the darkness itself is the number of people who have stopped noticing that the room has gotten darker. Your grandparents knew that God was real, not as an abstract proposition. They knew it in their bones, the way you know your own name. They prayed the rosary on their knees. They fasted. They feared offending God more than they feared offending their neighbor. That was not some primitive superstition. That was sanity. That was contact with reality. That was a soul properly oriented toward its final end. We have lost that orientation, and we have lost it so gradually that most people don't even know it's gone. Here is the spiritual condition of our age, as plainly as I can state it. We are a generation that has been anesthetized. The enemy has been extremely clever. He did not come in loud and obvious. He came in through the television, through the entertainment, through the education system, through the slow but systematic dismantling of every institution and every practice that used to tether the human soul to God. He made us comfortable. He made us busy. He gave us just enough pleasure to keep us distracted and just enough suffering to keep us bitter, but never enough of either to actually wake us up. Mystics tell us that God permits suffering precisely because suffering, when properly received, breaks through the fog. It forces the soul to confront questions it would otherwise avoid. Why am I here? Where am I going? Is this all there is? But we have become so good at medicating our suffering, so good at distracting ourselves from the existential discomfort that points us toward God, that even the mercy of suffering is being wasted. This is the condition, and unless you understand the condition clearly, you cannot begin to address it. Wake up. The fog is real. The first step out of it is simply acknowledging that you're in it. People misunderstand the devil. They think of him as some kind of cosmic cartoon villain. Red suit, pitchfork, obvious. They imagine demonic activity as the stuff of horror movies, levitation, spinning heads, voices from the walls. And because their life doesn't look like that, they conclude they have nothing to worry about. That is exactly what he wants you to think. I have been doing exorcism work for decades. I have spoken to demons under obedience in the context of the church's rite. Well, one of the most consistent things I observe from demons of varying rank, in cases across many different countries and cultures, is a level of strategic patience that should make every one of us deeply uncomfortable. The demonic hierarchy is not random. It is organized. There is a chain of command in the infernal kingdom that mirrors in a darkly twisted way the angelic hierarchy. Rarely here snorts. And the higher-ranking spirits operate not on the time scale of days or weeks. They operate on the time scale of generations. They plant seeds of corruption that are designed to flower 50 years later when the grandchildren of the person they first tempted. They work through institutions. They work through ideologies. They work through cultural trends that seem on the surface to have nothing to do with the supernatural. Let me give you a concrete example. The sexual revolution of the 1960s did not begin in the 1960s. The philosophical groundwork for it was laid in the 1800s. The academic groundwork was laid in the early 1900s. The psychological groundwork, the deliberate reframing of sexual morality as repression and neurosis, was laid by Freud and his disciples in the early 20th century. By the time the revolution erupted visibly in the culture, it had been prepared for over 100 years. And the consequences, the broken families, the fatherless children, the pornography epidemic, the contraceptive mentality, the complete disintegration of sexual sanity, those consequences are still unfolding. We are still living inside the damage of a plan that was set in motion generations ago. That is how the enemy works. He is a creature of deep time. He has been watching human beings since the fall. He understands our weaknesses better in some ways than we understand them ourselves. He knows exactly which pleasure to offer, which fear to exploit, which intellectual pride to flatter. He is a student of the human soul, and he has had thousands of years to perfect his curriculum. Now, what is the specific strategy being deployed against this generation? I can identify at least 4 major prongs, and all 4 of them are simultaneously active right now. First is the destruction of the interior life. The enemy knows that a soul with a genuine prayer life, a soul that is regularly in contact with God through contemplation, silence, the sacraments, is extremely difficult to manipulate. Such a soul has a finely tuned interior compass. When something is spiritually wrong, it can feel it. When a temptation presents itself, there is a formed conscience that recognizes it immediately. The enemy, therefore, has invested enormous energy over the past century in making silence intolerable to the modern person. The noise is not accidental. The constant stimulation is not accidental. The inability of modern people to sit alone in a room for 15 minutes without reaching for their phone is not a neutral cultural development. It is a strategic spiritual disarmament. If you cannot be silent, you cannot pray. And if you cannot pray, you are defenseless. The second is the destruction of the family. The family is the basic cell of civilization and the basic unit of the transmission of faith. The faith does not primarily travel through universities or through diocesan programs. It travels from father to child, from mother to child in the home, in the daily life of a family ordered toward God. The enemy knows this, which is why the sustained multi-generational assault on marriage, on fatherhood, on motherhood, on the very concept of permanent commitment has been so ferocious. A generation raised without a coherent family structure is a generation without roots. And a soul without roots will grab onto anything, any ideology, any movement, any false substitute for transcendence, because the God-shaped hole at the center of the human person cannot be left empty. The third is the corruption of the intellect through ideology. The enemy cannot destroy reason, because reason is a faculty given to us by God, and its proper use leads toward truth, which leads toward God. But he can corrupt it. He can train an entire generation to use the tools of reason in the service of unreason. We have watched this happen in real time in our universities, in our media, in our public discourse. Entire categories of reality, biological sex, natural law, the objective existence of good and evil have been simply declared to not exist by large portions of the educated class. This is not stupidity. These are often intelligent people, but intelligence weaponized by pride and untethered from humility before objective truth becomes one of the most dangerous forces in the world. A man who is convinced by sophisticated argument that evil is good is far more dangerous than a man who sins out of weakness and knows he is sinning. The fourth, and this one I want you to hear very carefully, is the targeting of the young. The enemy is not spending the majority of his resources on people who are 50, 60, 70 years old. Their habits are formed. Their trajectories are largely set. He is spending his resources on the generation currently between the ages of 12 and 30, because that is where the future of the church is. That is where the future fathers and mothers are. The children who are being formed or deformed right now will be raising the next generation within 20 years. And what I am seeing in that population, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, should keep every Catholic parent awake at night. The strategy is sophisticated. The strategy is patient, and it is working. The only counter-strategy is the one the church has always proposed: radical, total, uncompromising commitment to holiness, not politeness, not niceness, holiness. There is a passage in the prophet Ezekiel that has haunted me for years. God is speaking to the shepherds of Israel, the priests, the leaders, the men entrusted with the care of his people. And he says this: "You have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, you have not brought back the strayed, you have not sought the lost, but with force and harshness you have ruled them." And then he says, "So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the wild beasts." No shepherd, food for the beasts. That is a theological statement about what happens when legitimate authority abandons its post. And I want to speak to this directly because it is one of the most painful realities of our moment and one of the most systematically avoided subjects in Catholic public discourse. We have a crisis of shepherding in the Catholic Church. I am not saying this to be sensationalist. I am not saying this to undermine anyone's faith in the Church herself. The Church, as the mystical body of Christ, is indefectible and holy. But the human element of the church, the bishops, the priests, the theologians, the chanceries, that human element is capable of failure. It has failed before, it is failing now. And the consequences of that failure are not abstract. They are showing up in empty seminaries, in collapsing mass attendance, in the complete spiritual homelessness of an entire generation of young Catholics who were never given a coherent, robust, demanding presentation of the faith. Let me be precise about the nature of the failure. It is not primarily a failure of orthodoxy on paper. Most Catholic leaders in the Western Church still technically affirm the Creed. They still technically affirm the Church's teaching on the sacraments, on morality, on salvation. The failure is a failure of courage, a failure of willingness to say clearly from a position of authority, this is wrong, this will damage your soul, this is not compatible with following Christ. The world has made this kind of clear speech socially costly. If a bishop gets up and says plainly that contraception is gravely disordered, which it is, which the Church has taught infallibly, he will be mocked in the press. He will lose donations. He will be accused of being out of touch, of not understanding the real struggles of modern families. And rather than accept that cost, most shepherds have simply stopped saying it. They have retreated into a kind of pastoral mush, warm feelings about accompaniment and journey and mercy that never actually proposes anything, never challenges anything, never demands anything. And here is the spiritual consequence of that retreat. When authority goes silent, people don't fill the void with common sense. They fill it with whatever the culture is telling them. They fill it with whatever the social pressure is most intense. They fill it with whatever makes their life easiest in the short term. Because that is what fallen human nature does without the guidance of formed authority. The wolf doesn't wait for an invitation. When the shepherd disappears, the wolf simply moves in. I have seen this in family after family. Catholic families who were never told, not once, by any priest bishop they trusted, that cohabitation before marriage was spiritually dangerous, that pornography was spiritually devastating, that missing Mass on Sunday was a mortal sin with real consequences for the soul, that certain political commitments are genuinely incompatible with Catholic faith, or they were never told because the shepherds were afraid of the reaction. And so these families made decisions based on the logic of the surrounding culture, suffered the consequences of those decisions, and often blamed the Church for not warning them, when the real failure was the silence of men who should have spoken. Now, I want to be careful here because there is a temptation, especially among traditional Catholics, to respond to this crisis with contempt, with a kind of spiritual superiority, an attitude of the hierarchy is corrupt. The mainstream church is useless. We're the only ones who have it right. That is a trap. That is the enemy's consolation prize for people who actually care about the faith. He cannot get you to leave the church, so he gets you to stay inside it with a spirit of bitterness, judgment, and separation that is itself a form of spiritual poison. Faith does not give you the right to despise after your shepherds. It gives you the obligation to pray for them, to hold them accountable through legitimate means, to speak the truth charitably but without cowardice, and to remain in the church not because her human leaders deserve it, but because Christ is there in the Eucharist, in the sacraments, in the indestructible structure he built, regardless of the failures of the men he has temporarily placed in charge of it. But accountability without illusion. We need to stop pretending that the crisis of shepherding isn't real. We need to stop explaining it away, minimizing it, or telling faithful Catholics who are genuinely confused and hurt that they just need to trust the process. The confusion is not the fault of the laity. The hurt is real. The damage to souls is real. When the solution, the only real solution, is a return to the kind of shepherding the Church has always called for. Men in authority who fear God more than they fear journalists, who are willing to lose their comfort, their reputation, their social standing in order to tell the truth to souls who are depending on them. When shepherds become silent, wolves get brave. The wolves are very brave right now, and the only answer is courage. I want to talk to the parents, because if there is one front in this spiritual battle where the stakes are the highest and the losses have been the most devastating, it is in the home, in the family, way in the relationship between parent and child. That is supposed to be the first school of faith, the first experience of love, the first image of the relationship between God and the human soul. When that front is collapsing, let me give you the reality. The average Catholic family in the Western world today does not pray together, does not have regular substantive conversations about faith, has not transmitted to its children a coherent, demanding, intellectually serious understanding of what the Church actually teaches or why it matters. The children in these families have been sacramentalized, baptized, First Communion, maybe confirmation, but they have not been evangelized. They have received the external forms of the faith without the interior encounter with the living God that gives those forms their meaning. And so, when they hit college, when they hit the real world, when the faith costs them something, a relationship, a social circle, an intellectual reputation, they have nothing to stand on. They leave. And the statistics on this are not ambiguous. Majority of young people raised in Catholic homes no practice the faith as adults. That is not a small failure. That is a catastrophic failure of transmission. Now, before any parent feels simply crushed by that, because I know some of you are listening with children who have left the faith, and I don't want this to be an occasion for despair. Let me say clearly, failure is systemic. It is cultural. It is institutional. The parents in most of these families were themselves not adequately formed. They were handed a diminished version of the faith, a vague, therapeutic, unchallenging version that didn't equip them to transmit the real thing. They did the best they could with what they were given. God's mercy is not limited by our failures. Pray for your children. Don't stop praying, but for those of you who still have children in the home, young children, teenagers, young adults, under your roof, I want you to hear me very clearly. The time for comfortable, where passive Catholic parenting is over. It was probably never acceptable, but it is certainly not acceptable now. Your children are being formed. The question is not whether they will be formed. The question is who and what will do the forming. Right now, the formation your children are receiving from the surrounding culture is extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily sophisticated, and almost entirely hostile to the Catholic vision of the human person. The entertainment they consume, the peers they interact with, the educational content they're being fed, all of it is operating from a set of philosophical assumptions about reality, about the human body, about sexuality, about the purpose of life, that are not just different from the Catholic faith, they are diametrically opposed to it. They are designed not by conspiracy, but by the internal logic of a culture that has rejected God to produce a particular kind of person. A person who is self-defined, self-expressive, self-referential. A person who measures all moral questions by the standard of personal authenticity and emotional comfort. A person for whom the concept of objective truth, let alone divine authority, is essentially unintelligible. That is the person your child is being shaped into by the hours they spend in that formation environment. What are you offering as a counter-formation? I'll tell you what I observe.
In most Catholic homes, the faith is present as background noise. Mass on Sunday, sometimes, grace before meals, occasionally, a crucifix on the wall, but the substance of the faith,
the theology, the philosophy, the lives of the saints, the demands of the moral life, the beauty of the liturgical tradition, the reality of supernatural warfare, that substance is almost entirely absent. It is not being discussed at dinner. It is not being read about in family life. It is not being lived in a way that is visible and compelling to a child watching their parents navigate the real difficulties of adult life. Children are not formed by propositions.